East. And incidentally, I'm going to get back to Iraq in just a moment. But for those of you who think that Israel is about creating a homeland for the Jewish people, you're as deceived as most of them are. It's partly about that, perhaps, but what it's really about is creating a surrogate fortress in the middle of the Middle East. The Israelis are being used as pawns. They're being used like old armies used to use sheep that ran before the armies. They're our surrogates. And their leadership knows that. Most Israelis probably don't. They think they're creating a homeland. But it's a very, very sad situation of what's going on there. And of course, the Lebanese and the Palestinians are caught in the middle of this. And Iraq is part of that too. We have to remember that Middle Eastern oil is the oil that's used by a great deal of Europe and China and Japan. If we control Middle Eastern oil, we control our biggest potential competitors: Japan, China, Europe. So it's very important that we do that. So in the 80s, we decided that Saddam ought to accept the same sort of deal that the Saudis had accepted. The economic hitmen went in and did their job on him, but he wouldn't buy. He'd been our man, but he wouldn't buy. If he had, he'd still be president of Iraq, and we'd be selling him all the tanks and fighter jets and all the chemical plants he wants. But he wouldn't buy. So he sent in the jackals. They couldn't take him out. His security was very good, and he had many doubles, many lookalikes. Now, in the case of both Roldos and Torrijos, the way we assassinate presidents like that, well, let me ask you a question. If you're the president of a country and you're surrounded by men with AK-47s and other heavy armaments, your bodyguards, and somebody wants to assassinate you, who's the most likely candidate to be your assassin? Your bodyguards, particularly if they happen to be trained at the School of the Americas. And Roldos' and Torrijos' bodyguards were trained at the School of the Americas. Almost all of them were. Now, we all know that men like that, trained in those schools, are usually pretty loyal to their trainers, their mentors. They were also very underpaid. And so, for example, in the case of Torrijos, what we did was go up to one of his bodyguards, sent his teacher from the School of the Americas to a couple of his bodyguards, who were making about $10,000 a year. And the mentors went in, the teachers went in and said, look, you know, you'd be doing this country a great service if you get rid of this man, this Torrijos. You've got to get him out of here. And incidentally, here's $100,000. You're only making $10,000 a year, so this is a pretty good deal. We could do that. In the case of Iraq, Saddam had been our man. He had been our assassin. He knew our ways. He knew how to protect himself. He had damn good security and all these look-alike doubles. Now, what's the stupidest thing you can do if you're bodyguard to a president? Shoot his double. And if you never know who you're guarding and somebody offers you a high price to shoot somebody and you don't even know who you're guarding, you're probably not going to do it, because, by God, if you shot Saddam's double, you and your family and everybody else you ever ran into on the streets, life wouldn't be worth much, would it? So we couldn't take him out. So in '91 we sent in the military, our military, and some of you people were there. We could have taken Saddam out at that time, and I think you who were there probably know that better than anybody else. But we didn't want to. Saddam was the type of man the corporatocracy likes. The strong man, could keep his people under control. He could keep the Iranians under control on their borders pretty well. He could keep the Kurds under control. We thought that when we took out his military, he would be sufficiently chastised that now he would buy our deal. So the economic hitmen went back to work on him in the 90s. Couldn't bring him around again, though. Again, if they had, he'd still be there. The assassins couldn't take him out again. So once again, the military went in. And they're still there. Of course, if we'd struck that deal with him, we would be building, our Bechdel's and Halliburton's would be building huge cities there and petrochemical complexes, just like they've done in Saudi Arabia. And of course, that's what they're doing there now, too, in a different way. But that's what this is all about. That's what these wars are about. From my perspective, that's what Iraq is about. Iraq is a classic case of failure on the part of economic hitmen and jackals. And when we fail, you guys go in to do the job. Well, I don't want to spend too much time on the bad news here. This is all the bad news. The good news is that we have reached a point in history today where we know that we live on a very, very small planet. There can be no question about this. It's a very tiny planet. We are one community. And we know, I know, that my daughter and her children cannot grow up in a stable, a sane, a sustainable, peaceful world unless every child in every country in the most remote corners of this planet also has that expectation. We all know this. It's become very, very clear to us. The conquistadores never had to worry about the Incas attacking Madrid. The Spanish and the French never had to worry about the tribal peoples of Africa and Asia attacking Paris and London. We know we're vulnerable. Our airplanes apparently were under attack yesterday in London. We've seen what happened in New York and Washington, and regardless of which theory you believe, we know something terribly tragic happened on those days. We know we're very vulnerable. We know that the most powerful, most well-financed army in the world can essentially be brought to its knees by people with homemade bombs strapped to their backs. We know we live in a very small world. We also know that today we have all the resources that we need to create a better world. 24,000 people die every single day from poor food, starvation, or hunger-related diseases. 24,000 people died on 9/11 from hunger. 24,000 people died today from hunger. But it doesn't have to happen. We have all the resources we need to change that. And that is the cause of so many of these problems, the fact that we've created a world where there's so much desperation, where there's so much poverty and anger and so much fear around the world. But we can change that, and that's the good news. And I want to talk a little bit about what we have to do to make that happen, and I don't really think it's that difficult. But before I do that, I just want to touch, having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America.